Hi everyone, welcome to this video which I'm doing from home on the strategies of terrorism. This is the Kydd and Walter reading, and what I want to do, same as in the other videos, I think, is just to sort of orient you towards the reading, talk about, give you some promises, I suppose, about the reading, about what it's going to do, what it's going to tell you, point out some of what I think are some of the more important elements of it, and then set you off on your path of discovery and reading about this. So I think it's about terrorism, it's about the strategies of terrorism. I think before we get to really the reading as such, one of the things to realize is that oftentimes in the media we're used to hearing about terrorists as sort of crazed, irrational, perhaps zealous actors, right, on the international stage, probably, right, or at least nationally around the world. Probably Al-Qaeda comes to mind, right? IS, Islamic State. Generally, we're generally preoccupied these days, certainly since 9/11, with sort of Islamist fundamentalist terrorism, right? Which is, I guess, Al-Qaeda I mentioned, and Islamic State. We mentioned Hamas is mentioned in the book, which is another group, right? That would be probably linked with Islamism, right? And certainly sort of a fundamentalist, radical Islamism. But of course, terrorism's existed for a long time. It's existed since the 70s, and of course, there's been Islamist terrorists since that time, but also terrorists of other political varieties, right? There's been Marxist terrorists. I'm thinking of the Red Army faction in Germany. There's been sort of nationalist, oftentimes nationalist terrorism, like the IRA, right, the Irish Republican Army, or the Basque separatists, right? So sort of those groups who are fighting for the independence, perhaps, of a particular region, right, changing boundaries. And the reading goes into some of the goals that terrorism and terrorist groups have. One thing that the Kydd and Walter do is they separate goals from strategies. What the reading is about mostly is strategies for achieving goals. And the idea is that the goal is some sort of end that the terrorists are fighting for, an end that the terrorists are trying to achieve, such as we mentioned sort of independence, perhaps, territorial change more generally. So the IRA, for example, were acting with a goal, an ultimate goal, to unite the whole of Ireland, the whole of the island of Ireland, under one government based in Dublin, right? So that's a territorial change. They might have other goals as well, right? And this is one thing that Kydd and Walter say, is that they might have goals nested within goals. So while their ultimate goal might well have been a completely united Ireland under the united and independent Ireland, right? That's a territorial change. They probably had other policy goals too, right? So in the 70s, there was lots of talk about sort of civil rights, right? Civil rights for Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland. So those might have been goals of the IRA as well. The sort of signposts on their way to other goals, right? So that's worth thinking about, right? But what Kydd and Walter want to do is they want to separate that sort of thing from the actual strategies of terrorism, right? Which might be, well, I think they mention, is it 5 broad strategies, right? Attrition, spoiling, intimidation, outbidding, provocation. Now, in this way, then we're not going to talk about terrorists like having a goal to intimidate, right? That's not really their goal, right? They might use intimidation, right, as one of the strategies on their way to the goal. So I'd like to separate those two things in your mind, at least while you're doing this reading. They don't have a goal, attrition, right? So they don't have a goal to kill as many people as they can, right? That might be a strategy that they use to get their goal, to achieve their goal, right? But their goals are going to be something that's going to fit into the sort of regime change, right? So we don't like this current government, we want a different government. right? We're not necessarily looking to change the territorial setup of things, but just to change this government. Maybe we don't have the means to do it via the ballot box, either because we don't have the political support to do that, or because there's no elections in the territory that we're in, or no fair elections or something. And so we're going to use different strategies to achieve that, right? To remove this government and replace it with a different government. Regime change, and maybe not just the personnel inside the government, but maybe the system of government. So the Red Army faction in Germany, right, wants to bring about a Marxist revolution, wants to fundamentally change the system of government in Germany, right? That probably goes along with regime change. Territorial change we've covered. Policy change, right? We've sort of covered that as well, perhaps only very vaguely, right? But the IRA might want access to certain types of housing, better housing or something for Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland. And again, that might be sort of a secondary goal to their primary ultimate goal of territorial change, right? But that might be a sort of a policy change. Social control, right? They want to, and again, lots of my examples are coming from the IRA, I suppose, because that's being from Britain, that was perhaps my most intimate sort of connection with terrorism, I suppose, right? In terms of growing up in the 90s, right? That was the terrorist threat was from the IRA, and so what were they trying to do, and what were they doing? But yeah, in terms of social control, one of the things that I remember about the IRA is that they would, in Irish Catholic neighbourhoods in Belfast and in other places in Northern Ireland, presumably, they would punish their own people, I suppose, right? The Irish Catholics living in Irish Catholic neighbourhoods, they would punish them for crimes, right? So if there was a burglary or something, and you're an Irish Catholic in Belfast, you might not call the police, right? Because the police is at the time the Royal Ulster Constabulary, right? They're a tool of the British government, right? An agency of the British government that you might not see as legitimate if you're an Irish Catholic in Belfast, right? And so instead of calling the police, you might call the IRA, and they might take the burglar and shoot him in the back of the knees, right? Kneecap him. So social control might be part of their goals there. Or status quo maintenance, which I think is a much more difficult thing to get behind in terms of terrorism, right? And I'm trying to think of what sort of terrorist groups there are whose goal it is to maintain the status quo. Usually you sort of get involved with a terrorist group to change something, right? Quite fundamental. So that's an interesting one. See if you can think of any examples of that, of terrorist groups that want to maintain the status quo, want to keep things the same as they are. I don't think you usually commit terrorist acts for that, right? You're usually just happy, right? That things are the way they are. If you're that happy about the way things are, you usually don't resort to that sort of thing. But interesting. I'll take their word for that. So there you go. So there's the goals. But again, what the reading is going to be talking much more about is strategies. Right? So how do they obtain these goals? And that's why it was important, first of all, or that's why I mentioned terrorists, sometimes they're sort of portrayed in the media as just people who are radical, who are not really rational anymore, who are committing these horrendous and atrocious acts, start with some sort of a lust for blood or something like that, right? Maybe some people get to that place, right? But generally, like in international relations and certainly in this reading, right, we're going to consider terrorists as sort of rational actors, right, logical actors, right, that are using the tools that are available to them in order to achieve the goals that they have, right? And so this really gets us to the very beginning of the reading, right? And one of the things that Kydd and Walter say, I think one of the sort of basic things that they say, and when I say basic, I mean that forms the basis of the rest of the reading, is this, that ideally, maybe not ideally, maybe that's not quite the right word, but I suppose ideally for the terrorists, like if it were the most convenient system possible for terrorists, a terrorist group would just say, look, we want a united Ireland, and if you don't give us it, we'll be disruptive. We'll be very disruptive. And then the British government would say, oh, well, we don't want to suffer the disruption, right? They say they're going to be very disruptive and we don't want that. And so let's give them what they want. The problem that Kydd and Walter see, and it might be an obvious problem, right? But it's good to point it out. The problem that they see with that is that, okay, now anybody can say that, right? Me and you, we could sit at home and say all day, you know, unless you give us what we want, we think this is quite a good idea. Maybe territorial change is quite a good idea. We think that. And if you don't give us it, then we're going to cause major disruption and you won't like it. You know, so you better give us what we want, right? So this is the problem, is that people who want change, people who want to change the world, they have, if they were able to do so just by talking, right? Talk is quite cheap. I could make a video now and send it to the president, right? In fact, I'm making a video right now, but I'm not sending it to the president. I'm sending it to you. But I could do that, and it's very easy and very cheap to do it. And I could make all sorts of threats that would be fairly cheap, right? Not completely free, because you know, if the police saw that I was making certain types of threats, then I could be put in prison. So there would be some risk, but it's fairly cheap, right? If I was very dedicated to a particular cause, then that would be a fairly low cost to pay. And everybody could do that, like, or lots of people could do that. And then, of course, like, if we were to sort of take it to its logical extreme, the fact that it's so cheap to make threats, and the fact that many people could and maybe would do that if they thought that they would get their way by doing it, then you'd have so many threats, right? So many demands from so many different groups that, you know, there'd be no stability, right? There'd be no stability at all. You know, think of if you could change the border just by making a threat, the borders would be flapping about all over the place, right? So because of that fact, right? Because talk is cheap, and because lots of people could do that, like, could make threats, idle threats, and something else, right? The other so and something, and so here's the other thing. The other thing is this: there might be a system in place for us to change policy, right? One way to change policy is, you know, if I wanted to, we just had an election yesterday, so I'm making this on Wednesday, the 4th of November. We just had an election, and on the ballot in Arizona was, you know, a proposition to change the policy on marijuana, right? To make marijuana legal for recreational purposes in Arizona, and it passed. Right, so one way to change policy is to in Arizona, at least, right, is to use a ballot initiative, get some signatures, get some funding, do an advertising campaign, and have an election and change the policy that way, right? And that's an acceptable way, right? But so here's the other thing about terrorists, right? They have to. The reason why they resort to the strategies that they resort to is because there's no way to change the policies or to change the borders that they want to change through other means, right? Because, you know, you couldn't. Well, in fact, this is again the IRA, right? But Northern Ireland, right? There is now a mechanism, right? Since the Good Friday Agreement, there is now a mechanism, an electoral mechanism, to change the boundaries, right? To make Northern Ireland part of the Republic of Ireland, right? And that's through a referendum, through a vote of all of the people in Northern Ireland. Now, that didn't really exist, I don't think, before the Good Friday Agreement. That's something that was introduced in 1997 to bring peace in Northern Ireland. But even if it had existed before 1997, that wouldn't really have been an option open to the IRA, because in a referendum, the majority of people would have voted to remain a part of the United Kingdom. So that wasn't a tactic that was open to them, right? So political means, so there has to be some political weakness, right? So in summation, right? Terrorist groups, they're rational. They have goals that are politically unpopular, right? That they couldn't, either that are politically unpopular, or the opposition to them is so great in some other way. So when I talk about Northern Ireland, it's sort of a democratic opposition, right, to making Northern Ireland part of the Republic of Ireland, at least up until fairly recently. And I think if you look at the numbers now and the numbers going forward, in a generation or two, the numbers will be in favour probably of joining the Republic of Ireland, and then there'll probably be a referendum, and then they'll probably join the Republic of Ireland. I hope I don't get barred from Britain for saying that. I don't think that's a secret though. So there's maybe a democratic opposition. Now, there might be other countries and other places where it's not a democratic opposition, but the government is, maybe the government's tyrannical and the government's very powerful, right? And there's some other opposition so the only way to get it is through these strategies that you're about to read about, right? And so terrorists engage in these strategies because they're rational, and they go down the list of ways to achieve the thing that they want, their goal. And they say, okay, well, we can't have an election either because we'll lose or because no elections are allowed. Okay, well, we can't just lobby the government because the government won't listen to us. Their interests are against ours, and they don't need to listen to us because they have all the power, something like that. Right? So you're going down a list, and eventually you come to the only option that's left, right? So terrorist groups, there's a certain weakness to them, right? A political weakness. In that they don't have the political power to bring about the thing that they want to bring about, their goals. They don't have the political power to do that. Either the democratic political power or the authority or some other source of political power. They don't have it. So there's a certain weakness to terrorism, to terrorists. So you're weak politically. You have these goals, and you want to achieve them, and so. It's rational then to resort to well, and you can't just threaten. So now you've got to back up your words, right? And this is what the reading's about. This is what Kydd and Walter's all about. It's all about they call it costly signaling. So we have cheap signaling, which is just making threats on YouTube or something like that, right? Which I don't recommend. I think that's probably illegal. But so there's weak signaling, which is just talking, right? Or making a placard maybe and going and standing outside of the Houses of Parliament or whatever and sort of waving it. It's relatively cheap, right? Anybody could do that. But to make it costly signaling, right? To signal something and make that expensive, now I have to take on big risks, right? And these big risks, they're explained in these different strategies, right? Which involve killing people usually, right, and destroying property and intimidating government officials and that sort of thing. Right? That's very costly. It's costly because you've got to, have weapons, right? And you're taking very large risks, even to death, your death, lots of other people's deaths as well. That's a very costly signal, right? That's much more costly than making a placard, right, and going standing outside of Parliament or making a YouTube video or something like that. Much more costly. And they have five strategies, and that's really what I want you to get out of it. What are the 5 strategies? Attrition, spoiling, intimidation, outbidding, and provocation. What are those strategies? How do they work? They also have in each section, they tell you, okay, this is what makes this strategy work well in terms of the targets, right? So what types of governments does this work well against? And they also have strategies to counter those strategies. So, okay, what should the government or the state do to counter these terrorist strategies? So that's sort of the most of the reading now. And I wish you all the best with it. I enjoy this one. It's quite practical. We sort of left the different approaches now, which are sometimes a little bit esoteric. They're interesting, and to be honest with you, I enjoy much more the theory side of things than I do the more practical side of things. But I recognize the sort of the benefit of practicality, right? And certainly, if you're going to go into public national security policy and those sorts of things, this is a great beginning, at least. If you haven't already had one, this is a great beginning into what are the strategies used by terrorist groups? How do you counter those? Right? This is, and that's really my promise, I suppose. See that if you read this, you will come away. I think almost everybody will come away, unless you've had specialized training in counter-terrorist strategies. You'll come away with a little bit of a better understanding about why terrorists behave the way they do and what governments can do to counter that, those actions by terrorists. So I'm going to end it there. I look forward to seeing what you see in the reading. I like your question. In fact, let me make a comment. And now this is specific to. I'm probably going to use this video in future classes, but this is in particular. This is some advice on the research questions, on the reading questions on the reading that you're doing in fall 2020, and it's this, right, that do put a question in. You know, it's part of the remit of, you'll see it on the syllabus, you'll see it in the question, in the assignment, as you're entering your question. I mean, it's called reading question. I think it's called reading question, and that's really what I'm looking for. I think it's an important skill to ask questions of a text, to read a text and sort of with the view to saying, how can I ask a question that will further my knowledge on this question? How could I have a discussion about this text? And so I am looking for those questions. All right, but that's it. I want to end there, just to say again, good luck, enjoy the reading, and as always, I'm available via email if you have any questions about what you read or about anything at all in the class.